Rise of Hawk, Part 2, Scene 18. Gora Prison was a broad, one-storied concrete building rotting on an acre of land. The back end of it was overgrown with large trees and an unkept garden. It was from this end he and Nama approached. Nama parked the van on the side of the road and left the vehicle. Talon followed, jogging across the tarmac into the overgrown greenery. They pushed through long threads of jade-coloured willow tree, and a slimy grey wall quickly revealed itself. Tay couldn't help but grimace when he nearly touched the slimy, water-stained surface. Following the wall, Nama walked ahead. Talon sensed that a great storm was building inside his friend, but he knew him well enough to just let Nama simmer without saying anything. His friend would work through it. He just needed time and company to do so. They stopped at a metal door. Talon expected it to be locked, but Nama pushed and stepped inside. Following, Tay closed the door behind him and looked around. The whole place was utterly blackened and burnt like someone had come through with a flamethrower. Looking above him at the mangled roof, he wondered why the walls were still standing, despite their being brick. "So you used to work here before you and Carla escaped the agency?" Ahead of him, Nama snorted. "Not in this section, obviously, but yes, in the less run-down part of this building. My first post was as a guard here." So how did you know about that unlocked door?" "It was one of my planned exits. I figured no one would think to look here if I escaped this way." Tay shuffled around the half-mangled door and into the next section of hallway. "Why didn't you escape then instead of later with Carla?" A few paces ahead of him, Nama shrugged. "I was put on leave and planned to escape once I got back on shift again, but on my break I met Carla." Laughing, Talon was about to call out something rude about sex being a poor excuse, but his foot snagged on something and he nearly fell on his face. He caught himself with his hands and carefully stood upright again. His laces were trapped in a collection of half-melted metal wires, and he leaned down to start untangling them. "Here we are. Where are you?" Nama called out to him through a doorway. "I'm here." Talon released his shoe from the metal and moved towards his friend's voice. He stepped into another space, which was wider than it was long, and filled with charred metal frames and half-melted springs. On the far side, Nama stood in front of a closed wooden door. He took off a long backpack and dropped it to the ground in front of him. "Can you find a hole in these boards? Tell me if the door across the yard is open." Talon stepped forward. The walls behind Nama were actually gaping window frames, which had been roughly boarded up. As he searched, he caught glimpses of a square courtyard beyond. It was dusty outside, and the concrete was broken up at various points by plants that had managed to push through to get at the sun. What windows outside that he could see through the gaps were also boarded up. He went around Nama, who was shuffling in his bag for various supplies. One board, immediately behind him, had a large hole in it, and Tay looked through it for a better view. Beyond, he saw an open door. "Yep, it's open. Can you see the guard tower up to your right?" He squatted down to get the correct angle and looked up above the roofline. There was a battered metal box, perhaps a couple of metres square, that stood above the old crockery roof tiles. "Yep, it's empty." "That's good." Nama lifted a crowbar out of his bag and adeptly popped the door lock. Leaving his crowbar behind, Nama grabbed an automatic rifle and stood up. "In and out as quick as you can. Got it?" "Yes, sir," Talon said with a slightly playful smile on his face. Nama snorted and led them outside. They crossed the dusty concrete yard and shot through into the doorway on the other side. A man sat eating some kind of pastry and reading a book, with an ocean of monitors in front of him. Nama fired his auto in a short burst. The man dropped his meal and slumped forwards in his chair. The room was small and cramped by boxes of paper and many different screens with various camera angles of the building. To one side of the monitors sat a control panel with a keyboard. Above the control panel was a metal grating that looked out onto the long, plain hallway. Nama pushed the guard to the ground using his foot and took his chair. He hit a big red button in front of him and an alarm sounded once. Shutdown has started. That should block off some of the guards for a while. Father Owen's in the room at the end, hey? Nama indicated a door behind them. Go and get him. I'll hold down the fort here, but be careful. The interrogator might still be in there. Okay. Tay stepped around behind Nama towards the door. Scene 19. The hall beyond the control panel gave Tay a distinctly uncomfortable feeling. Rats skittered ahead of his footsteps. Broad windows to his left had been loosely boarded up, choking the sunlight into haphazard lines that cut across the dusty air. 5 big rusted metal doors, like those on giant ovens, were stacked horizontally to his right. He jogged past 4 of them and found the door at the end was open a little. Through the gap he heard a low voice. It was dark inside, and he was certain it would be impossible to go in, find the bad guy, and shoot him before he was shot himself. So Tay kept his distance out of sight. Yes, what is it? An impatient voice barked from inside the darkness. For a moment Tay's mind was blank, and then he lowered his voice an octave. There's a message for you, sir. It's urgent. A sigh sounded through the gap. Fine, stay here, guard the prisoner. A blue suit, at least 10 years older than him, stepped out of the gap. The man had black hair and dark, angry eyes. The interrogator halted in surprise. He looked Tay up and down, likely noticing that he wasn't wearing a guard uniform, and went for his gun. Tay already had his weapon up and fired first. The man let out a cry of pain and fell back onto the floor. Leaning over the agent's prone form, Tay searched his jacket and found a weapon. As he stood, he dropped a spear into his black pocket. It was very dim and damp inside the cell. He couldn't see much despite the open door. A line of sunlight pushed through the gap, fighting against the pitch black, and illuminated the outline of a figure tied to a chair with his back to the door. A face looked back over his shoulder at him. The person's eyes reflected the flecks of sunlight, making them seem to glow a vivid ice blue. Father Owen? Talon? His voice was a gasp whisper. What are you doing here? Pulses of pain on different levels emanated from the priest, so much so that Tay couldn't tell the extent of his injuries. Pulling out a knife from his pants pocket, he approached the chair to cut him free. Nam and I are here to bake you out. The ropes that tied the young priest to the chair were wet with something slimy, and only after touching his arm and sensing the distinctive shaft of agony from a bullet wound did Talon realize that it was blood on the rope. You're shot. Not as bad as it could have been. His voice was a little stronger. How did you break into a prison? Long story. Talon's knife cut through the rope and freed Father Owen's hands. But I think Lady Krenna was fixing luck in your favour today. Talon put his knife away and, focusing on making a psychic barrier between them, he helped lift the young man to his feet. Well, he heard a smile in the priest's voice. I am relieved for such treatment. They stepped out into the hallway in the dust-choked sunlight. Talon looked sideways. Father Owen's bruised face was pale and tense with pain, but Tay was surprised to see that his eyes were clear and awake. He didn't seem to be in shock or about to faint, even though blood dripped down his left arm to his fingertips on the floor. He must have only just been shot. Come on, we have to be quick. Yes, of course. Do you have a spare weapon? Tay smiled back at the priest. You want to help? He nodded slowly. If I can, yes. Fetching the alien's gun from his back pocket, Tay handed it to him. Funny for a priest to know how to use a gun. A one-sided smile flashed in his direction. I wasn't born a priest. They made their way up the hall and entered a guard control room to the thumping pulse of automatic weapons fire. Nama sat crouched on the floor in front of the metal grating, with his auto pointed out at the hallway beyond. The weapon paused, and Nama glanced sideways at them. Alarm's been tripped before I could stop it. There's guards in the tower above the yard. Reinforcements are on their way, and I've only got a couple more clips for this auto. We're trapped. Either of you happen to have a brilliant escape plan? Talon sensed a deep shaft of fear in Nama, despite the tone of cynicism in his voice. Father Owen's voice was quiet. Are you two telepaths? Tay frowned. Yes, but... The priest lifted a slightly shaking and bloody hand to his weapon and cleared the chamber. Talon and I can take care of the guard tower. When we're done, he can signal the all clear for you to withdraw. Tay frowned at Nama. The mirrored look of puzzlement in his friend's face shifted slowly into an apathetic shrug. It didn't matter how a priest knew how to help. What mattered immediately was that there might be an escape. Nama turned back to the grating to fire out into the hall, and they skirted around him to the yard door. Talon looked sideways at Father Owen. So what are we doing? Simple. I'll draw their fire and you shoot them. There was no fear in the man, and Tay wondered for a moment if he was just exceptionally cocky. What direction is the guard tower? To our left. Tay pointed with a thumb. What do you mean, draw their fire? Just be ready to shoot them. I can't do this for long while injured. Father Owen closed his eyes for a second, and then he skittered out into the yard. Gunfire sounded almost immediately, and bullets hit the concrete millimetres from the priest's feet. He ran zigzagging across the yard as if his feet knew where the next bullet was about to hit, and dodged out of the way. He's a dodge talent, thought Tay with surprise. Stepping out of the doorway, Tay lifted his weapon and aimed at the guard tower. There were 3 figures in the middle box, and he fired at them. One fell almost immediately, the second took 2 shots to drop out of sight, but the third returned fire. A bullet ricocheted off the concrete next to Tay's feet, and he flinched. As he re-aimed, another gunshot fired from across the yard, and the third man fell away. Tay stared at Father Owen. Remembering Nama, he shook his head and reached back into the control room. Yard's clear, Nama. Right, I'll be there presently. Dropping his gun, the priest stepped out of sight through the door across the yard. When Talon passed back into the burned-out section of the prison, Father Owen sat on the floor, panting. You can dodge bullets? Tay stared at the younger man. Are you a talent? How come you can shoot? Are you an agent? A tired smile met his questions. Did you know that there are only 2 professions from which the agency can't conscript? Tay frowned. No, how is this? The armed forces, because they're already working for the government, and the other, the man's smile widened and Tay sensed a flare of mischief, is the church, because a person's duty to the founder is a higher calling than their duty to patriotism. Talon's frown deepened. So you are a talent? Nama dove through the doorway and landed on his side next to them. Come on, kids, let's get out of here. Talk later. Scene 20. They jogged down a long hallway, through many half-melted and barred doors towards the exit. Nama was in front of the priest and Tay in the rear. About 3/4 of the way down the hall, Father Owen swayed unsteadily on his feet and swerved sideways to put his hand on the nearby wall. Careful to block and minimise the psychic pain, Tay ducked under the man's good arm, gripped the Tay's waist. Careful to block and minimise the psychic pain, Tay ducked under the man's good arm, gripped the priest's waist to keep him upright while driving his unsteady feet towards the door. His voice was very tired. I'm okay. No, you're not. Now's not the time to faint and make a pret of yourself. Come on. Ahead, Nama got to the door and turned back to look at them. Tay answered his unspoken concern, mind to mind. Worry about what's outside. I've got him. Nama nodded and lifted his auto as he slipped outside. Walking crookedly, he and Father Owen made their way to the exit. As they came outside, Nama's auto fire started again. The greenery of the overgrown garden swallowed them, and he struggled to keep them both upright. As they stumbled, Talon sensed a mumbled mental noise that slowly came out of the weary agony inside the priest's mind. Life is breath, breath is life. A male voice, calm as if in prayer, faded into a second voice. I'm so sorry. The woman was whimpering and sobbing as if in pain. I didn't see what he was doing. Will you forgive me? Life is breath, breath is life. The 2 voices, one chanting calmly, the other gasping and whimpering, overlapped and slipped back down into the dark grey shadows of the young man's mind. Neither voice hurt Talon, but both were loud enough in his senses to make them stumble awkwardly to the edge of the wild greenery. Nama, he reached telepathically. Sound of Nama's autofire paused for a moment. Go now, I'll cover you. Come on, Father Owen, we're almost there. Tay shuffled his arm into a stronger position around the young man. Together they stepped forward, pushing through the bushes and bursting out of the green into the road. He pulled them towards the van on the other verge. As they got to it, the van door slid open in front of them, and Nalana reached out to help Father Owen inside. Nama stood in the middle of the street several metres away. Tay opened the driver's door for him and turned to watch his friend. Nama fired another quick burst, and further up the road 2 guards dropped. Abandoning the auto, Nama turned to run towards them, and Tay jumped into the back of the van. The doors slid and slammed closed, and for once Nama's old van started up on the first go with a jolting lurch. Father Owen lay on the metal in the back of the van with his eyes closed. He looked very pale and his breathing was rapid. Blood had run down the front of his black shirt and arm, and it looked like a lot. Nalana took off her battered jersey and placed it firmly over the wound. Father Owen was conscious enough to flinch in pain, but his eyes didn't open. Tay, keep pressure for me. He leaned over and put his hands firmly over the wound. He could sense the pain and weariness in the priest, as well as Nalana's tense fear, but it wasn't invading him anymore. He wondered for an absent second when in all the madness had he learned how to shield. Nalana put her hands either side of Tay's on Father Owen's shirt and closed her eyes. He sensed the flow of warm, buzzing energy. It pulsed in his mind with a layer of warm white static that was time psi, and overlapping it was a calm blue empathic peace. Combined, Nalana's healing energy felt like a warm, forceful, buzzing thing, almost with a life of its own. Father Owen's breathing deepened and the tension in his limbs released. Where's Ren? Said Nala. Zay's at the evac base. Nama called from the front seat. We're going there now, once I make sure we're not being followed. How is he? If we can get him to Ren quickly, he should be okay. Looking over the front seat at Nama, Talon sensed that his old friend was fearful and a little rattled. He needed something to loosen the mood. New base? Don't you mean my new base? A snorted laugh sounded from the front. Not yet it ain't. Remember, you've no cell members other than you, Nalana, and the children. Tay smiled. Nama felt better already. What about Asha? What about Asha? She's Hawk's territory. Likely she'll stay wherever he is. Father Owen's eyes were still closed, but he spoke drowsily. Asha? Just rest, Father Owen. You're okay now. Nalana stroked the young man's face, and Tay sensed that pulse of warm, buzzing energy again. The priest's consciousness seemed to fall sideways into sleep.